Move out! Now! Yes, sir! Go, go, go! Moving! Go, go, go! Move! Keep pushing! Hurry up, Walter! Let's go! Move! Keep pushing! Yes, Sergeant! All right, men, this is over! Yes, sir! Let's go! Keep formation! Watch the flanks!
The night is black. No moon. March 22nd, 1945. Along the Rhine's western bank near Oppenheim, soldiers of the 5th Infantry Division crouch in the darkness, waiting. They can hear the river ahead, Germany's ancient boundary, the last natural barrier before the Reich's heart. No artillery pounds the far shore. No bombers thunder overhead. Just silence. Minutes ago, most of these men thought they were going into reserve. Now trucks are pulling up loaded with assault boats they've never seen before. Orders come down in whispers. You're crossing tonight. Right now. The Rhine. Germany's mightiest river. No preparation, no warning. Some men ask if this is a joke. It isn't. Within hours, they'll be on German soil, and the enemy still won't know they're there. This is Patton's gamble. Crossing the uncrossable without permission, without notice. Racing to beat the British, racing to end the war. What the soldiers said when they realized what was happening would reveal everything about fear, duty, and the final collapse of Nazi Germany. On the morning of March 21st, 1945, Major General Leroy Irwin, commanding the 5th Infantry Division, called his regimental commanders to headquarters, expecting to discuss routine matters. His division had just finished brutal fighting in the Saar-Palatinate, conquering 22 rivers across France, Belgium, and Germany. The men were exhausted. Irwin assumed they would finally get the rest they desperately needed. Instead, he received orders to report immediately to the Rhine Corps headquarters. When he returned an hour later, his face told his officers everything. Something had changed. The 5th Division, Irwin announced, would cross the Rhine River. Not next week. Not after Montgomery's massive operation to the north. Tonight. Maybe even in a few hours. The commanders sat in stunned silence. The Rhine was not just another river. It was the symbol of German power. The barrier that had protected Germanic lands for 2 millennia. Allied intelligence reported 21 German divisions positioned along its banks. Montgomery was planning a crossing involving 1 million troops, thousands of artillery pieces, and airborne divisions. That operation wouldn't begin until March 23rd. Patton wanted the 5th Division across 24 hours earlier, with no artillery preparation, no air support, and equipment that was still being rushed forward from depots 100 miles away. Colonel Paul Black, commanding the 11th Infantry Regiment, would lead the assault. On the afternoon of March 22nd, he was at his battalion command post in Nierstein, a small town 1 mile from the crossing site at Oppenheim, when confirmation arrived. The crossing would happen that night. Black looked at his watch. In less than 8 hours, his men would be paddling assault boats across Germany's greatest river in total darkness. The soldiers received the news with reactions that ranged from disbelief to grim acceptance. Sergeant Michael Bilder of the 5th Division later wrote that the order seemed insane. They had been racing at full speed for an entire day just to reach the Rhine on Patton's impossible deadline. Now they were supposed to cross it immediately, without the massive preparation everyone assumed would be necessary. But they also understood why. Patton was in a race with Montgomery, and the race mattered for reasons beyond personal rivalry. Every day the Germans held the Rhine gave them time to organize defenses in depth. Every hour of delay meant more American lives lost in future battles. If the 5th Division could get across quickly and quietly, before the Germans realized what was happening, they might establish a bridgehead that would crack open Germany's western defenses. Private William Tucker, whose unit would be in the assault waves, later recalled the moment orders filtered down. At first he thought it was a joke. Then trucks arrived loaded with assault boats, and suddenly it was very real. Tucker had trained on river crossings, but this was different. This was the Rhine. This was Germany. This was history, and he was about to be part of it, whether he was ready or not. As darkness fell on March 22nd, soldiers moved to their assembly areas near the river. They could see the Rhine ahead, wide, dark, moving fast with spring floods. On the far bank, German territory, the fatherland. Everything the war had been fought to reach lay across that water. Officers passed final instructions in whispers. No smoking, no lights, absolute silence. The Germans on the far side didn't know the Americans were coming. Surprise was everything. If German artillery caught them in mid-crossing, The assault boats would become floating coffins. At 10 o'clock, the first boats entered the water. The assault boats moved through darkness propelled by soldiers rowing with whatever strength remained after months of continuous combat. No engines, no noise, just the sound of water against hulls and men breathing hard in the cold March night. Private Tucker later described the crossing as surreal, paddling across the Rhine like it was a training exercise, expecting at any moment to hear German machine guns open fire. But the machine guns stayed silent. The first wave reached the eastern bank without opposition. Men scrambled out of boats onto German soil, weapons ready, hearts pounding. Still nothing. They moved inland, securing the immediate shoreline, waiting for the storm of fire that military doctrine said should be tearing them apart. It never came. The Germans on the far shore, elements of exhausted, depleted divisions that had been shattered in the Saar-Palatinate campaign, either didn't detect the crossing or lacked the strength to respond effectively. Some German units were so weak they simply melted away when they realized Americans were across. Others surrendered without fighting, relieved the war was finally over for them. Wave after wave of assault boats followed the initial crossing. By midnight, thousands of American soldiers were on the Rhine's eastern bank. Engineers worked frantically to expand the bridgehead and prepare sites for the bridges that would follow. Navy and Coast Guard personnel arrived with larger landing craft. LCVPs and LCMs that had carried troops onto Normandy beaches now ferried soldiers across Germany's greatest river. Lieutenant Commander William Leeds' boat unit followed at 3 in the morning and immediately began a non-stop ferry schedule that would continue for 72 hours. The landing craft transported men, vehicles, supplies, everything needed to sustain and expand the bridgehead. The operation that Patton's staff had thrown together in less than 48 hours was working beyond anyone's expectations. Sergeant Bilder, reflecting on the crossing years later, admitted he and his fellow soldiers may not have liked Patton personally, but they recognized his results. The general could justify his prima donna attitude with accomplishments that other commanders couldn't match. And crossing the Rhine quietly, without the massive preparation everyone thought was necessary, proved Patton understood something fundamental about modern warfare that his more cautious colleagues missed. By dawn on March 23rd, the 5th Division held a bridgehead 6 miles deep. They had captured 19,000 demoralized German prisoners. The soldiers' initial fear had given way to exhausted satisfaction. They had done something remarkable. They had crossed the Rhine against minimal resistance because Patton had moved so fast the Germans couldn't organize effective defense. But the real story of the night wasn't just tactical success. It was psychological. American soldiers who had fought from Normandy to the Rhine understood they had just crossed Germany's last major natural barrier. Beyond the river lay the German heartland. The war wasn't over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany had no more rivers to hide behind, no more prepared defensive lines that could stop the Allied advance. One soldier, whose letter home was preserved in division archives, wrote that crossing the Rhine felt different from any previous operation. In France and Belgium, they had been liberators, but stepping onto German soil on that dark March night, they became conquerors. The distinction mattered. It changed how they saw themselves and their mission. The soldiers also understood what their crossing meant for Montgomery's operation, scheduled to begin that same evening. Secretary of War Henry Stimson in Washington would soon declare with barely concealed satisfaction that Patton had crossed the Rhine while Montgomery was still preparing his massive assault. American soldiers in the 5th Division took pride in that accomplishment, even as they prepared for the German counterattacks they knew would eventually come. Patton did not learn about the crossing's success until the morning of March 23rd. When 13th Corps Commander General Manton Eddy confirmed that the 5th Division held a secure bridgehead on the Rhine's eastern bank, Patton immediately telephoned Omar Bradley. His words were characteristically direct, but uncharacteristically restrained. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Bradley, genuinely surprised, responded, "Well, I'll be damned. You mean across the Rhine?" "Sure am. I sneaked a division over last night, but there are so few Krauts around there they don't know it yet. So don't make any announcement. We'll keep it a secret until we see how it goes." The soldiers who had made the crossing possible heard about this conversation through the military grapevine. Some found it amusing that Patton, normally eager for publicity, wanted to keep their achievement secret. Others understood the strategic calculation. If the Germans didn't realize Americans were across in strength, they couldn't concentrate forces for effective counterattack. By the evening of March 23rd, secrecy was no longer possible or necessary. The bridgehead had expanded substantially. Engineers had constructed pontoon bridges capable of supporting heavy vehicles. Armor was crossing. The operation had succeeded beyond anyone's hopes. Bradley authorized announcement of the crossing, ensuring American forces got credit for beating Montgomery across by one day. On March 24th, Patton made his famous gesture that soldiers witnessed with a mixture of embarrassment and amusement. Standing on a newly constructed pontoon bridge, the general relieved himself into the Rhine, while photographers recorded the moment for history. "I've been looking forward to this for a long time," Patton told the troops watching. The soldiers recognized the act as pure Patton, crude, theatrical, but also deeply meaningful. He was literally and figuratively defiling the river that had symbolized German power for centuries. One engineer who had worked on constructing the bridge later recalled feeling vindicated by Patton's gesture. His unit had labored nonstop for days building the span that allowed armor and supplies to flow across. Patton's crude celebration acknowledged their accomplishment in terms soldiers understood. The general might have been vulgar, but he never forgot that his victories depended on ordinary soldiers doing extraordinary things. The announcement of the Rhine crossing made headlines worldwide. In Washington, Henry Stimson delivered his pointed comment about giving Montgomery everything he asked for, while Patton crossed with ad hoc tactics and sheer audacity. American soldiers in the 5th Division heard about these reactions through Armed Forces radio and letters from home. They took pride in what they had accomplished, even as they faced continued combat to expand and secure the bridgehead. German resistance, initially light, intensified as Wehrmacht commanders realized what had happened. Artillery fire increased. Luftwaffe bombers attempted night raids on the bridges. German infantry launched counterattacks designed to slow American exploitation of the crossing. The worst fighting occurred around Oppenheim on March 26th, when German forces made determined efforts to push Americans back across the river. But by then, it was too late. 2 bridges spanned the Rhine at Oppenheim. Navy landing craft patrolled miles of river in both directions. More than 15,000 men and 1,200 vehicles had crossed between March 23 and 26. The bridgehead was secure and expanding. Soldiers who had crossed in darkness on March 22nd now watched as entire divisions flowed across behind them, pouring into Germany's interior. Once across the Rhine, Third Army exploded eastward with momentum that German forces could not contain. The soldiers who had made the silent crossing at Oppenheim now found themselves part of an advance that covered ground faster than anyone thought possible. Towns fell so quickly that maps became obsolete before they could be properly studied. German units that tried to establish defensive positions discovered American armor already in their rear areas before fortifications could be completed. The pace exhausted soldiers who had been fighting continuously since Normandy. One infantry private wrote home that he could barely remember crossing the Rhine because everything since had been a blur of movement, brief firefights, and captured German soldiers who seemed relieved the war was over for them. The letter captured something essential about the final weeks of combat in Germany, the sense that history was accelerating toward inevitable conclusion. Soldiers' attitudes toward German civilians they encountered varied considerably. Some maintained professional discipline while viewing all Germans as enemy population that had supported the regime. Others, particularly soldiers who entered small villages where white flags hung from every window, felt complicated emotions about occupation duty. These were not French citizens welcoming liberation. These were defeated enemies whose country had started the war and now faced consequences of that decision. The discovery of concentration camps fundamentally changed how American soldiers viewed the enemy they had been fighting. When elements of Third Army liberated Ohrdruf on April 4th, soldiers witnessed evidence of systematic murder that exceeded anything they had imagined possible. Patton, Bradley, and Eisenhower toured the camp on April 12th. Patton, who had witnessed years of combat carnage, was so disturbed he vomited after viewing stacks of corpses. Soldiers who had crossed the Rhine 3 weeks earlier now understood they had been fighting something more than a conventional military enemy. The Nazi regime represented evil that went beyond normal warfare. Letters and diary entries from this period reveal soldiers processing what they had seen and struggling to comprehend how such systematic brutality could have occurred in a civilized nation. The realization affected how soldiers treated German prisoners and civilians. Before the camps, many American troops had maintained grudging respect for German soldiers as fellow professionals caught on the wrong side. After the camps, that respect evaporated. German prisoners asking for food and medical attention now faced soldiers who had seen what Germany had done to its own prisoners. The humanity that American forces generally maintained, adherence to Geneva Convention standards, continued, but the psychological distance between captor and captive increased dramatically. By late April, Third Army soldiers were fighting in Bavaria and pressing toward the Czech border. The pace had slowed from the immediate post-Rhine crossing period, but forward movement continued. German resistance remained sporadic. Some units fought skillfully and determinedly. Others surrendered at first opportunity. The pattern reflected Wehrmacht's complete disintegration as coherent military force. Soldiers who had crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim looked back on that night as the moment they knew the war would end soon. Before the crossing, Germany still had natural barriers to hide behind. After the crossing, there was nothing left but the final collapse. The silent crossing in darkness had been more than tactical success. It had been the beginning of the end. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. For soldiers of the 5th Infantry Division who had crossed the Rhine on that March night, the surrender brought relief, exhaustion, and complex emotions about what they had witnessed and accomplished. They had been part of the force that ended the Third Reich. But the cost of that victory, measured in lives lost and trauma endured, would stay with them forever. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, soldiers had time to reflect on their Rhine crossing and what it had meant. Letters written during this period reveal pride in tactical accomplishment, combined with sobering awareness of war's human cost. The silent crossing had succeeded partly because Patton moved faster than German defenders could respond, but also because German military power had been fundamentally broken by years of warfare on multiple fronts. The soldiers recognized that their crossing had been possible only because thousands of other soldiers in other units had fought and died in earlier battles that depleted German strength. Normandy, the Bulge, the Saar-Palatinate, every campaign had contributed to making March 22nd possible. The Rhine crossing wasn't just Third Army's achievement, it was the culmination of Allied efforts across years of war. What the soldiers said about Patton during and after the war reflected complicated attitudes toward their commander. Many admired his aggressive leadership and believed his methods saved American lives by keeping Germans off balance. They credited him with understanding modern mobile warfare better than more cautious commanders who wasted lives in methodical operations. The Rhine crossing exemplified Patton at his best, bold, audacious, achieving spectacular results with minimal preparation. But soldiers also expressed more critical views based on their experiences during operations that hadn't gone as well. Some believed Patton's drive to beat Montgomery had sometimes pushed units harder than necessary, producing casualties that better planning might have prevented. These more nuanced assessments reflected combat veterans' ability to distinguish between successful operations and those that could have been conducted differently. The lasting impact of the Rhine crossing on the soldiers who made it cannot be measured solely in military terms. For men who crossed in darkness on March 22nd, the operation represented proof they had survived to witness Germany's defeat. Many had fought from Normandy or earlier. They had seen friends killed. They had endured conditions that tested human endurance. Crossing the Rhine was vindication, not of any particular ideology or strategy, but of their own determination to finish what they had started.